At over 400 hectares of coastal rainforest, Stanley Park is often called the Jewel of Vancouver, and for good reason. This park, established only 2 years after the city was created, has a storied past. But that story doesn't begin when the park was founded, not when the city was either. Stanley Park's story starts 3,000 years ago. The earliest evidence of humans living in the Stanley Park Peninsula dates back to over 3,000 years ago. Here, near what we now call Lumberman's Arch, was Huaihui, the most prominent village in the area. It was inhabited by the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Chathus was another settlement at the northern tip of the peninsula. First Nations peoples had been living here for thousands of years, when explorer Jose Maria Narvaez conducted the first exploration of Burrard Inlet, passing by the peninsula in 1791. George Vancouver was the first to actually map out the Stanley Park Peninsula, doing so in 1792. Not much happened between Vancouver's visit until the early 1800s. As settlers began to arrive in Vancouver, they began to use the land's resources. Some areas of Stanley Park were logged for timber and clearing land, and this increased during the 1858 Fraser Gold Rush. Communities of Portuguese, Scottish, and Chinese settlers formed, including at Brockton Point, Deadman's Island, and Anderson Point. In 1886, the Canadian Pacific Railway built its terminus station in Vancouver. This was critical to the formation of Vancouver as the population boomed. That year, on April 6th, Vancouver was officially incorporated as a city, and though a fire burned down much of the city, City Council formed a makeshift city hall in a tent. The first order of business of the newly formed Vancouver City Council to petition Ottawa to turn the peninsula into a public park. Construction on the park's main road, now what we call Stanley Park Drive, began soon after in November that year. However, this road's construction came at the detriment of both the First Nation and settler population. To make the road, the residents were labeled as squatters and were forced to leave their homes. Those who lived at Huaihui were forced to move to nearby reserves. The buildings were demolished to make room for the road. Non-Indigenous settlers were also evicted from the park. But with all of these obstacles out of the way of the city, the park was officially opened on September 27, 1888. 1 year later, on October 29th, the namesake of the park, Lord Frederick Stanley, formally dedicated the park. Lord Stanley threw his arms up to the sky and dedicated the park to the use and enjoyment of peoples of all colors, creeds, and customs for all time. I name thee Stanley Park. In the 1920s, the last remaining residents were evicted after a series of legal battles. As we have seen, and will see, the city and the Parks Board took much effort to maintain the image of Stanley Park as an untouched wilderness throughout much of the park's history, even if it meant erasing the past. In 1924, at the same time the Parks Board was at court with the last remaining Indigenous families, they were planning a replica Indian village, which would include houses, canoes, and totem poles. These would be based on Haida settlements rather than the groups that actually resided in the park. 4 totem poles came from Alert Bay on North Vancouver Island and were repainted to look more cheery. But despite the excitement around the project, they failed to raise the estimated cost of $7,000, which today is almost $130,000. However, the totem poles, along with many others, have been placed near Brockton Point. Throughout the history of the park, people took resources from the land. The Indigenous groups that had resided there had been using their resources since the beginning for food and shelter, and that pattern continued with the settlers who set up shop on the peninsula. However, when the city turned the land into a public park, this practice was banned. This embodied a key point of conflict around the park that persisted for many decades. Lower and working class residents of Vancouver wanted the park to be used, while the middle and upper class wanted the park to be preserved. What had been called hunting was now poaching. Foraging was banned. Logging was outlawed. What had been acceptable just years ago was now unacceptable. Of course, these practices persisted. Lower and working class residents also wanted the park to be used for active recreation. Think tennis, think cricket, these citizens wanted the space to be used. On this front, the park board was a little more lenient. Brockton Oval was created in 1891 and was mostly used for cricket, but it was the only sports facility in the city for several years. But by the 1900s, there were many new sports facilities, including a playground, tennis court, and pool, built around Second Beach. This progression did not go unchallenged, of course. The middle and upper class wanted the park to be preserved and peaceful. Currently, it seems we have hit a happy medium. The interior of the park is tranquil forest, while there are many facilities scattered around the park, such as pools, tennis courts, and more. It seems a bit silly to say Stanley Park is an untouched piece of land, especially with the development we see now. But even still, many people are not aware of the true extent of the park board's influence on the peninsula. Throughout the 1800s and into the 1900s, construction in the park was large-scale and consistent. Near the end of the 1800s, there were a few bigger projects that were installed in the park. In 1889, an emergency reservoir was installed at Prospect Point, following a shipping accident that broke a water main. In 1890, the Brockton Point Lighthouse was established. But at the turn of the century, things really began to pick up. There are a few main projects that are inseparable from Stanley Park. Firstly, there's the Stanley Park Causeway. Secondly, there's the Lionsgate Bridge. And of course, finally, the seawall. Let's start with the causeway. This is Cole Harbour. It used to have a bridge which crossed it, which was the most used entrance to Stanley Park, and was Vancouver's first impression of the park. However, there was one problem with Cole Harbour. Its tides. You see, as the tides rose, it would spill over onto Second Beach, making the area marshy and wet, and separating the rest of the park from the downtown area. Then, as the tide fell, it would recede back into the inlet, exposing a wide, muddy area. Thus, the park board approached what they deemed as a tidal problem with a two-pronged attack. Firstly, it was decided Second Beach was to be filled with 13,000 cubic meters of sand. Driftwood and boulders were removed, and bathhouses and picnic areas were built. By doing this, the land was raised enough so that even at high tide, the connection between the park and the city would not be severed. This also meant the beach could finally be useful to the public. Secondly, and most importantly, was Cole Harbour itself, where the tides were causing the most issues with its exposed mudflats. In 1909, the wooden structure of the bridge had decayed to the point that the park board needed to replace it. The park board found they could kill two birds with one stone and solve the tide issue as well as replace the bridge. This part of Cole Harbour is also called Lost Lagoon. It got this name because as the tides fell, the lagoon receded back into the inlet, which left behind all that mud. To fix this as well, the board decided on the proposal that we see today at Stanley Park, the causeway. A causeway is dissimilar to a bridge in that it has few to no openings underneath its road. This idea had the benefit of keeping water inside Lost Lagoon, getting rid of the ugly mudflats. Famed landscape architect Thomas Mawson's services were requested to design this project. He created several proposals, some modest and some involving minimal intrusion into the park land, and some grandiose and comprehensive. Mawson's accepted proposal included a museum, a stadium, lounges, and other public facilities in its design, and created a large circular pond out of Lost Lagoon. Public pushback was immediate. The thought of a stadium inside the park was too much for some. This did not stop the Parks Board from continuing to support Mawson's proposal. However, the 1913 Depression did, killing all momentum and support for Mawson's vision. The one thing the Parks Board and the people could agree on was that the mudflats had to go. So Chief Engineer Frederick Fellows was given the task of designing a causeway to replace the bridge. The causeway was built between 1915 and 1917, separating Lost Lagoon from Cole Harbour and Burrard Inlet, and most importantly, solving the issue of the rising tides. This also cut off Lost Lagoon from Cole Harbour, and the Parks Board shut off the salt water from the pipes entering from Cole Harbour in 1929, turning Lost Lagoon into a freshwater lake. The second main project was the Lionsgate Bridge. Prior to its construction, The main way to get across Burrard Inlet was a bridge at Second Narrows and a ferry at First Narrows. In 1927, a plebiscite was held for the approval of the construction of a bridge spanning First Narrows. The votes came in a clear defeat. This was mostly due in part to the requirement of a highway being constructed which would bisect Stanley Park in order to connect the bridge to the city. But in 1933, a second plebiscite was held regarding the bridge's construction. Yet again, the votes came in. A victory! In just 6 years, the public completely changed its opinion on the bridge. But why? The key factor in this complete 180 was the Great Depression, which, when the second vote occurred, had been going on for 4 years. People were desperate for work. Stanley Park had already been used to relieve some of this pressure. The city paid workers to clear dead trees in the park. The construction of a bridge was another much-needed opportunity to create jobs, and lots of them. At its peak, it had 334 workers on the payroll. Construction began on March 31st, 1937. And after 2 years and $5 million, or $100 million today, the bridge was open to pedestrians on November 12, 1938. Cars were allowed on the bridge 2 days later. On May 29, 1939, Queen Elizabeth and King George VI visited the bridge to chair its official opening. Throughout the years, Lionsgate Bridge has received several improvements, including an additional lane and traffic signals. Perhaps the most impressive was the complete replacement of the entire original suspended structure throughout 2000 to 2001. Because of the slowly deteriorating structure of the original bridge, each section of the bridge was removed and lowered to a barge below, and replaced with a stronger, lighter structure. The renovation of the suspended structure notably took place while the bridge was still being used, a world first. To many, the bridge was a sign of the future. However, some still bemoan the fact that in constructing the bridge, a large road was driven straight through the park, cutting it in two. Without the Great Depression, this feat of architecture would not have been able to link the North Shore to downtown Vancouver, but it also changed the park irreversibly. But whether you believe it was worth it or not, you must admit the Lionsgate Bridge is an imposing and impressive structure. Though the Lionsgate Bridge is well known, Stanley Park's most famous project is, of course, the seawall. Initially, the seawall started with a short stretch of wall to prevent erosion around the Brockton Point Lighthouse in 1914. But in 1915, park engineer Andrew Wooten pointed out the erosion of the sandstone cliffs near Second Beach. It only got worse as when shipping traffic increased the waves against the shore, soil and rocks tumbled down the sides. Some parts of the road had begun to wash away. Further inspection by the Vancouver Harbour Commission found more spots where the instability was becoming an issue. The park board went to Ottawa to secure funding for a wall around the entire peninsula to stop the slow wearing away of the park. Funding was secured, and construction of the seawall as we know it began in full. Master stonemason James Cunningham oversaw the construction of the seawall for over 30 years. Under his watch, over 10 kilometers of the wall were constructed. Even after he retired in 1955, he was said to still come out to supervise the construction, even once coming out at night in his pajamas. In 1963, Cunningham died, and his contributions are marked in a plaque near Seawash Rock. The seawall was completed in 1971, but the full loop around Stanley Park only finished in 1980. Throughout 60 years of construction through storms and floods, the history of the park can be found within the wall. Different eras of construction can be identified by the rocks used. Bricks, granite, rocks, and even gravestones were used to create the wall. The finished result was the completion of Stanley Park's most well-known symbol. The Parks Board estimates an average of around 20,000 people visit the seawall per day. Cyclists and pedestrians alike find it relaxing to circle the park, but conflicts did arise when the two groups interacted. Throughout the early days of the seawall, bikers and pedestrians clashed. Bikers whizzed dangerously close past the pedestrians they felt were only getting in the way, and collisions between the two increased until biking was made illegal on the seawall in the 1970s. Of course, people still cycled on the wall, even when police had handed out over 3,000 tickets. The problem was eventually solved when City Council agreed to widen the road to fit a bike lane. Now, both groups travel the seawall in harmony. Well, most of the time, anyways. There's a common theme between all of these three projects: the causeway, the bridge, and the seawall, and it applies to the way of thinking about the park as a whole as well. These three projects all fight against nature. We see the park board consistently label natural processes that have occurred well before any humans arrived as problems. The flooding of Second Beach and the exposed mudflats were fixed with the causeway. The road leading to Lionsgate Bridge cleaves the park in two, and the natural erosion of the peninsula was prevented with the seawall. Across the history of the park board, the city, and the citizens have shaped and molded the park for their own use, seen in the constructions of reservoirs and sports facilities, but at the same time, they view it as a time capsule, a snapshot of nature preserved for thousands of years. Yet nature is not constant, it's ever-changing. Erosion, flooding, even fires were all regular occurrences in the park until human intervention. Is this a good or bad thing? Depends on how you look at it. The seawall, for example, prevents the erosion of Stanley Park, but at the same time it causes sand to be washed away from the sandy area in front of it, where marine life is most common. Without new sand from the sandstone cliffs, this zone is slowly declining. What is important to be preserved and what is not? For the time being, Vancouver has decided the peninsula is worth keeping over what is around it. However, these natural occurrences are here to stay, and Mother Nature seems to want to make that known.
A portion of the Stanley Park seawall is closed again after heavy rainfall triggered a mudslide.
Vancouver shores are getting battered by some of the highest tides of the year.
The sudden closure of a popular section of the seawall path near Science World had pedestrians.
Kids pulled us out.
Waves on heading off access between here.
In the winter of 2006, massive windstorms ripped through Vancouver and made their way to the park. Across 3 storms, over 10,000 trees were torn down, about 10% of the forest. Parts of the seawall were destroyed as well. This was a wake-up call for many Vancouverites. The storm was the first in recent memory and one of the most severe in the park's history. Citizens grappled with the park they believed in, an unchanging, constant space, being ripped apart overnight. This wasn't the first storm in the park's history, but it was big enough that it seemed to finally rip away the veil over the city's eyes. The park board changed its policies to recognize the connection between the park and the city around it, and planned restoration efforts built around Vancouver's conditions, not just a return to the status quo. Newer policies now fully acknowledge human intervention in the park. But even with all this effort the city has put into preserving and now growing with the park, it's impossible to fully stop the force of nature. The seawall consistently gets damaged during king tides, most recently in 2022 and 2024. The hemlock looper moth, native to the area, experiences surges in population every 15 to 20 years, and results in widespread tree defoliation and mortality, especially to the western hemlock and Douglas fir. This weakens the trees, putting visitors at risk. Each time another issue arises, people are quick to repair and set out plans to manage it. The story of Stanley Park is not one of preservation. The park has been changed severely by human intervention. Even if we did our best to keep it the same as how we found it, the constant rush of waves against the shoreline, the windstorms, natural fires, and animal behavior would inevitably change the park. The story of Stanley Park, then, is a lesson in change. Both humans and the course of nature have had a hand in shaping the park, but trying to hide these facts or simply being ignorant of them will only make the wake-up call even harsher. Even before the bridge, or the seawall, or the causeway, or the road, or even the creation of the park itself, humans have been using and shaping the land we now call Stanley Park. And Stanley Park is beautiful, but it's important to understand how we arrived at its current form. It's not a pretty road from the indigenous groups 3,000 years ago to having highways and pools and sports facilities, but it is a road we have walked nonetheless. Now, all we can do is educate ourselves, reconcile with our past, and most importantly, grow, just like the park has.